Well, hello and welcome to the Hawaii International Real Estate Council presentation, Legal Issues and Updates for International Buyers and Sellers in Hawaii. My name is Patrick O'Neill. I'm the president of the Hawaii International Real Estate Council, and we're so glad that you could join us today. By the way, in my day job, I am the principal broker and owner of Luxury Homes International. But again, good to see everybody here today. Of course, our thoughts and our prayers go out to all the people affected on Maui. I'm sure everyone on this webinar has been touched in some way, either by a family member, a friend, or a colleague. It seems the best way we can help support Maui right now is through financial contributions. There are many great organizations out there right now. One of them is the Realtor Association of Maui Community Fund. The Hawaii International Real Estate Council has made a donation to this fund. If you're interested, website is on the screen right now, and we'll also drop some information in the chat. Want to say thank you to Crystal Bisay and Wendy Brown at the Hawaii Association of Realtors for coordinating our event today and all that they do throughout the year. Crystal is in the Zoom control room, so Crystal, thank you for that. And thank you also to the board members who dedicate time throughout the year to the Hawaii International Real Estate Council. By the way, if you're interested in getting on our board or helping out in any way, please reach out to me or reach out to Crystal. We'd love to hear from you. I know we have some guests with us today, so just want to tell you a little bit about the Hawaii International Real Estate Council. We're a nonprofit. It's coordinated under the Hawaii Association of Realtors. We organize educational presentations throughout the year, which are focused on international clientele buying and selling here in Hawaii. You can see some of the topics that we cover throughout the year. If you are working with international clientele or maybe want to expand your base into international clientele, this is one of the best groups that you can belong to. And the membership is only $30. What a bargain, right? And webinars like today, if you're a member, are completely free. You can see a list of other goodies that you also receive for that. But again, it's only $30. And if you are a guest joining us today and you paid $10 to be a guest, we've got a great deal for you. Just add another 20 to that and you will have full membership with the Real Estate Council. So we'll give you credit for the $10, add another 20, get your full membership. Members also have immediate access to our video library. Today's presentation is an example of that, but you can go back, you can revisit these things. I look at them all the time. There's so much information, and the speakers that we bring in are just fantastic. Also, if you are a member, and this is for members only, coming up August 31st at Waialae Country Club, we have the mid-year real estate review with Paul Brubaker. The cost is $30. It includes lunch, and I can tell you, you can't get lunch at Waialae for $30. The only way we're able to do this is with the generosity of the sponsors, in particular the platinum sponsors, Aaliyah, Ward Village, Castle and Cook, and Luxury Homes. So again, if you are a member, you can sign up for this. I'll caution everyone, this sells out every year and we're getting close to the maximum. So if you're interested, get your membership, log in for this one. It's going to be a good one. Also, coming up next month in September, we have David Garfield. He's an immigration attorney, one of the top guys in Washington, D.C., who also has an office here in Hawaii. A lot has changed with the current Biden administration, so you want to check it out, find out what's happening in the world of immigration. And he really focuses the conversation on what is important to us as realtors and our clients. I think you'll find it fascinating, so don't miss that. September 22nd, more information will come out. At the end of Craig's presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. So just drop it in the Q&A down below and we'll consolidate those questions and ask Craig. There'll also be a short survey after the presentation. So I think it takes 1 minute. If you would just fill that out for us so we can see how much you enjoyed today. And as I mentioned, there will be a copy of the presentation available for all the HIREC members that are here today. Quick disclosure. Obviously, we're going to have a conversation which is general in nature, should not be considered legal or tax advice today. Okay, On to our speaker today. Can't tell you how happy I am to have him here. Craig Wagnild, pardon me. Craig Wagnild is a 25-year real estate veteran. He's a partner at Lung Rose Voss Wagnild. The firm was ranked one of the best law firms in the country by U.S. News and World Report. Craig is a former president of the Hawaii Bar Association and has been ranked one of Honolulu's top attorneys. And by Best Lawyers, has been named Lawyer of the Year for business organizations and Lawyer of the Year for real estate. He is fluent in written and spoken Japanese. And on a personal note, I had the opportunity to work with Craig not too long ago and found him to be fantastic. 5-star recommendation from me, Craig.
Well, wow. With that intro, I should just open for questions.
That's right. Yeah. And truly, thank you very, very much for doing this today. I know how busy you are, and it's invaluable, the information that you're going to share. So thank you.
Absolutely. No, it's my pleasure and a real honor to be able to speak with everyone. And I guess the only thing is that we're still doing it by Zoom. And so I don't get to actually see all of your faces and meet and talk with each of you, which is fine, but it's obviously a lot more fun if we could all get together and sit in a group. I'm going to try and figure out real quickly. We did this earlier, so I'm just going to try and share my screen so that I can get this up and going. And if you don't mind confirming that you can see the screen.
Perfect. You did it. You got it.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to sign out. You take over, and I'll be back for the Q&A.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, as Patrick mentioned, my name is Craig Wagnild. I'm an attorney. I practice in transactional law. So I do buying and selling of real property, buying and selling of businesses, development of real property, those kind of things. I work for a law firm. Almost all of my partners are all litigators, but we concentrate in real property development, construction type stuff, and then in business law. So I've sort of found, well, I should mention before we get there, because Patrick had raised this in the support for Maui and such. One of the things that we're doing now is I'm working with a lot of our Maui clients that have most of them are commercial properties, but I have commercial properties in Lahaina and that were affected and or just completely destroyed by the fire. We're advising and working with them on issues involving their tenants and their leases, their insurance. Many of them had commercial loans, and we're going through the loan documents and helping them figure out what the obligations are with the lender and how to coordinate that with insurance. So all of these kind of logistical things and such are part of a service that we help provide to our clients and to others. So if you know of people that are in that situation and could use our help, we're happy to do it. We'll jump in and, depending on their circumstances stuff, work out something that works for them, because so many people are suffering and just dealing with things right now. So we're happy to do that. I guess an interesting thing happened, and this was many years back in my practice. I sort of developed this odd niche, which was that I sort of started, falling into help try and fix real estate project, deals that were falling apart. And I don't know exactly how that happened. It's not something that I aimed at or aspired to do. It sort of worked out that, a deal was falling apart. I helped with that. And word got passed from broker to other broker, real estate agent, talking about, oh yeah, if something's falling apart, give him a call. And that's been, it's been a gratifying part of my practice, I think, but it's been one of those areas that is always new and is always a challenge, because everybody's problem is different. And some problems can't be solved and such. But I did find that a lot of them that came up that dealt with foreign clients from Japan or other places, had some similarities. And so I noted that there were kind of 3 different causes, particularly with our Japanese clients or others, that led to these problems. If one was just, and it's obvious, it's just a misunderstanding of the circumstances, a misunderstanding of how things were supposed to work, a misunderstanding of what was expected from them and when. Another was a failure to meet expectations. And I think that oftentimes that came about because the Japanese or international client came in with an idea of how they expected everything was going to work, what the property was going to be like, how things were going to be done, and who was going to do it for them, who was going to pay what costs, irrespective of what was in the documents. That was just the expectation. And so oftentimes those expectations were missed in part because of the misunderstanding or missed expectations. And then finally, there are logistical and technical problems. I mean, things that either weren't anticipated or weren't planned for well. And so, really my major piece of advice to just about every real estate agent, broker, and such is to plan ahead. And if you have an international client, whether it's a buyer or a seller, anticipate that there are going to be a lot of things that are going to affect your ability to move as quickly as you can and to do things the way that you usually run things in connection with a conveyance, purchase and sale of real property, such. So I sort of came up with there's no magic to the number, but I sort of came up with 10 things that I thought I'd run through with you. And then I would like to be able to open up for questions, comments, discussion, because, there's I don't have any monopoly on the kinds of issues that you deal with international clients and such. I'm sure each of you has your own experiences and stories and could just as easily be up here giving this presentation and explaining the things that you've had to deal with and overcome. Some of these may sound really familiar to you as a result. So let's start with number one, which happens a lot, which are scheduling and timing. A lot of times when you're entering into a real estate deal, if you're just, let's take a standard, purchase and sale of a residential property and such, you're completing your Hawaii Association of Realtors standard purchase contract. You're filling in the dates. You're planning out how long your due diligence period is going to be and when the closing is going to happen. And as you're doing that, if you have an international client, say you have a client that's in Japan, are we taking into account the fact that, one, not only do we have a time difference, so contacting and dealing with that is, but we have a date difference. I mean, it's the next day in Japan. And so obviously the client should know and everyone should realize that that's going on, but sometimes it's not taken into account when you start calculating what day it is in Japan. Oh, that's a Saturday or a Sunday for them. So I need to actually get something to them, ahead of time. The other one is, and I'm going to jump ahead real quick here to the next slide, is that we have national recognized holidays in the state of Hawaii and in Japan that are different. I'm not expecting you're going to get these, but when you get the presentation, they're in there. And then there are also obviously federal holidays as well. But we have all of these holidays, but they don't match up, right? I mean, we have different holidays going on in Japan. So one deal that I was pulled into at one time, they had scheduled the closing over Golden Week, and nothing's open, and they'd sent over the deed to be signed and other things, and they couldn't move money, there were a lot of issues there. And everyone was pointing to the, time is of the essence provision and other things in the contract. And from the standpoint of, what turned out to be my client and such in it, that was just simply an impossibility. Ultimately, cooler minds prevailed. Everybody worked together. We got the situation resolved. But it was in part a problem because from the get-go, someone could have looked at those dates and realized, oh, this isn't going to work. Or we really need to plan far in advance. We need to get money into escrow at least a week ahead of time, or we're going to run out of time. But the deed hadn't even been sent over until everything was shutting down. So that wasn't going to work real well. In addition, we have the time of the essence provision in the contract. I know that's, everybody checks that off almost automatically because they're like, oh yeah, these dates are all important. And they are, but building in time, particularly for international clients, building in a little bit of time, And we're talking about, 5 business days, not something huge, but building in a little bit of time where a party can, because of a problem or an issue that arises, has a right under the contract to extend, will save yourself a lot of heartache later. And usually is not that much of a give if you're explaining that the reason for that is that we have an international client. I mean, just issues come up, and we hope not to be able to have to use it, but it can. Okay, so there was recognized holidays. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about a little bit was HARPTA and FERPTA. I know that you've had other presentations, and that was one of the areas actually that Patrick had listed in the types of topics and such that are covered by this organization, and I think that's I'm not going to go into such detail that on this, that it's going to that it would cover all the stuff that could be covered by somebody who really knows and works with this. But generally speaking, I wanted to talk a little bit about what this is and how it works. So let's talk about FERPTA first. FERPTA is a federal statute, and it's Internal Revenue Code section 1445. And basically what it's doing is trying to make sure that a foreign international person, someone who's not a resident of the United States, doesn't buy property, get a whole bunch, make a whole bunch of money off selling it, and then take all that money back to their country where we can't get the tax portion on that. I mean, that's basically what's going on. Okay, but how do we do that? And that the way that that's done is that they say, okay, there's a withholding agent, and the withholding agent is actually the buyer. And the reason for that is that the withholding agent is going to be here and has property here that they can attach. So they've put the onus on the buyer to ensure that the tax gets paid. And that means either there's an exemption or there's a withholding. One of those two is going to have to happen. Now, as a practical matter, in Hawaii, we use the escrow system, and the escrow becomes a withholding agent and enforces this. But basically the transferee has to deduct and withhold, and it's 15% on the FERPTA, has to withhold that money and submit it to the IRS unless there's an exemption. And so there's an exemption, a certificate of exemption that can be filed. And I put some other information about, if you have, for example, property that's partially held by a foreign person and partially held by a resident, and also where there's a corporation, for example, that a foreign corporation owns property. But going back, we have, so that's kind of how that works. So the most obvious situations are where you do this and everyone's a resident, and the exemption forms are sort of signed as a matter of course, and it doesn't really affect the sale. But once we get into a scenario where even if your client is a resident, if the seller is an international person, is not a resident of the United States, they're going to have this either come up with an exemption or it's going to have to be a withholding. And that may be a surprise to them. They may not have planned for that. But I think you want to make sure, just so your client's expectations are there, if you represent a client that's international, that's going to be an issue, and that means that money is going to have to be withheld unless we have some other way of getting an exemption. So it affects sellers, but it can also affect buyers, so we have to be ready, for that, because. So I think that's one of those things that planning ahead, if you represent an international client or you're getting into a deal with an international client, that's addressed. And buyers, if you represent a buyer and that buyer is a Japanese resident, a resident of the state of, the country of Japan or another country, you want to plan ahead. You want to think, because they're going to be a seller at some point. And simply changing it, saying, well, we'll create a single member LLC and we'll put it in that. That can work depending on how you have it taxed and such, but that will not necessarily work. It is by nature a disregarded entity, and as a result, we'd look through and to the owner, who is foreign national, and FERPTA would still apply. Okay, and so then we get to HARPTA. HARPTA is essentially Hawaii's equivalent of FERPTA. It works essentially the same way. It's just dealing with whether or not somebody is a resident of the state of Hawaii. So now we're not talking really about international necessarily. We could also be talking about someone from another state that's a resident of another state. Operates very similarly. We have our exemption form, which is Form N-289. That's the one that you usually see that escrow is passing out on normal sales where we're not dealing with non-residents and such. If you don't have that, again, you're going to have a withholding on the state side. So the third thing I wanted to talk about briefly, because it goes to those expectations and stuff, is real property taxes. So generally speaking, unless they're going to move and they're going to live here and live in the property regularly, buying into property here in Hawaii will mean that they're not going to get the Hawaii resident deduction from real property tax. When you complete the form for the conveyance tax and such, you're going to be indicating where the real property taxes and stuff need to be sent. And you're also going to be checking off whether or not they're going to be a Hawaii resident. The real issue that sort of comes up with a lot of properties, and it used to be, oh, this is only affecting the uber rich, and so it's not as big a deal, but is what's referred to as Res A and how that applies. And that is a bump up for essentially intended for second homeowners who are buying, luxury properties here in Hawaii, and let's get as much money as we can from them. So residential A taxation is essentially a two-tiered application of tax that applies to residential properties where the owner is not a resident, and two, has purchased this property and it has a value over $1 million. Now, arguably, that should probably, particularly after the last tax assessment, be bumped up to something more than $1 million, but it hasn't been. And so the way it works is you're taxed at 0.45% on the first million, and then 1.05% on everything over $1 million. So I gave an example at the bottom. If you had a $1.5 million house, that one's not going to be as dramatic. It's when somebody's come and bought it, one of these $10 million homes somewhere. Boy, real property tax is going to be significant. And the other thing is that sometimes people aren't telling the tax department. I just had a client contact us and was shocked that they bought this house. They weren't, one of their relatives is living in it over here, and but they're not living in it, and they're not residents. And it was essentially discovered, and as a result, now Res A applies to it, and it's a significant, the taxes went up significantly. And, the question was, well, is there anything we can do? And I mean, the short answer is no, not really, unless we're going to put it in somebody else, or you're going to decide to move to Hawaii, or we're going to somehow pull your relative into your family. And so it can be a challenge, but this can be significant money that's involved. For real property taxes in Hawaii, obviously it's assessed once a year. This past year, everybody kind of went crazy and decided to increase the values much higher than for almost all of the island here on Oahu, at least, well beyond what it was before that. You pay twice a year, and so it's bifurcated for the payment. In the sale, you're going to have provisions in there that are going to prorate any taxes that have been paid, and that's just done as a matter of course. The fourth area that I've seen a lot of issues and problems with have been the execution of the final closing documents and such, in particular dealing with notaries. As you know, the deed and some of the other documents are going to require original signatures, and the deed and sometimes other documents are going to need to be notarized. If your client or the party on the other side is, for example, in Japan, then we have to deal with having that document notarized in Japan, or the person needs to fly over to Hawaii and sign it, which is another way to do it. But so U.S. notaries in Japan, they're there, okay, but you can't just do it anywhere. So, if you look at the way that's set up, and again, this is way too much information for one slide, in my opinion, but I wanted you to see this and have it. So when you get the presentation, you can hold on to it and stuff. Probably the most important thing in here is to look at it and see the first subpoint that says, make an appointment. There are no exceptions. Okay, if you are going to go and try and use a notary at a U.S. embassy in Tokyo or anywhere else, or a consulate, you are going to need to make an appointment. Those appointments are limited, and those appointments, depending on the time that you want to do it, either may not be available, or you may have to wait a week or two, or whatever it is. That means, from a planning perspective, sending out the deed to be executed, even if you're sending it by email for them to print out, is not going to be something you can do just a week before closing. You likely will not get it signed, notarized, and back to you in time. So given that, you need, in a case involving signatures that are going to need to happen overseas, that's something you need to be planning well in advance. And then there are other, obviously, requirements and such there. There are Japanese notaries, and it is possible to do that with an apostille. The challenge to those is often scheduling as well. But it's also the fact that Japanese notaries don't just notarize the signature, they're notarizing the document, which means that as a matter of law for them, they have to see, read, and understand the document. So if a deed's not really long, but depending on what you have, if you have a mortgage or something else, it may be longer. These need to be translated into the Japanese language, and a translation needs to accompany. So again, a cost and a time commitment to utilizing those as opposed to going to the U.S. notary. I put a quick note on U.S. notaries in Hawaii. I mean, this isn't just Hawaii, this is anywhere, but we've tried to find workarounds, fly the notary over. No, that doesn't work. U.S. notaries are not permitted to go over and outside of their jurisdiction, notarize documents on foreign soil. We can't do that. We can bring them here, or they could fly to somewhere else that has, if they fly over to another state or and such, they could have it notarized there. But again, the originals then and all of that are going to have to come back, and the notary certificate is going to have to be made specific to wherever it is that they are signing. Okay. Number 5, tax issues. So I am not a tax attorney. I'll start with that. I do not advise clients about taxes. I know just enough to be very dangerous. And so what I know is to tell you that they need to be, that when we get into deals where our client is buying, for example, a significant piece of Hawaii real estate, I will always have them consult tax professionals, both, either here in Hawaii or in Japan or in both. These can get really complicated in a hurry, and I would not assume that they either know it or understand it or that they've already planned for it. There are foreign investment disclosure requirements as well that may apply in connection with that. So I have a number of people that I work with, regularly, that I advise, that I pass clients on to when those tax type issues come up. I also noticed that very quickly when the screen came up that Patrick had a list, and of the past presentations you've had is one by Jessica Sue on tax and such for foreign deals and such. So I suggest go take a look at that. But anyway, this is one of those things that can be the tail that wags the dog. So you definitely want to make sure that your client's looking into this and that it's being addressed. And likewise, estate planning. And I'm not an estate planning attorney, but I work closely with estate planning attorneys. And oftentimes, this is another tail that can wag the dog. And it often works really closely with tax. And so you're looking at this in terms of what they want for this property. Is it an income producing property? Is it a family? Is it they want it to pass on? What do they want to happen with it? But it goes to how we're going to have title taken. And it's how we're going to set up vesting. And many times in the contract, that's like really soon after the contract is signed, you have to come and tell them how you intend to take title. So you either want to extend that period or make sure that you're talking about this very early on with the client. Because again, when they become a seller, is this going to be an issue? Or if they pass away and the property is going to pass on, have we planned or at least help them plan for those contingencies and such? I always go through the kind of what happens if. It's the same questions that I talk to people about when they're getting into a new business. You know, what happens if you pass away? What happens if things change and you no longer want the property? What happens if your family, somebody else in your family passes away, or you become unable to sign or to do anything, so that the property's there but you can't act on its behalf? Who's going to do that? I mean, a lot of those type of questions, this is the time to ask. So the next one I had was due diligence, because in buying and selling, whether it's a commercial property or it's a residential property, there's going to be this due diligence that needs to take place, and you're trying to coordinate it with someone whose first language may not be English, who isn't here or may not be here, and who isn't necessarily going to understand what all's going on with this, and may have expectations based on their experience in their own country as to how this works and what they're going to get. So I think you want to be very clear early on with clients about who's going to coordinate and set up everything from if there's going to be a home inspection or an inspection of the property, who's going to coordinate and set those things up, and then who's going to conduct them, and how are we, and then what are you going to do with that information? How is that information going to be provided, whether it's in the form of a report or otherwise? Is the client able to read and understand that, or who's going to go through it with them, or is it going to be provided in their language in some way, or in a way that they can Google Translate it or whatever? But all of that goes to their expectations and how things are going to work, so that they can reasonably go through things. So I had a couple of examples. I mean, condo docs is a big one. I can remember one problem, one client that I had come in, and one of the problems was they had no idea what any of those, they got sent this giant pack of English language documents, and what those are like. You've got a declaration and bylaws and all this stuff and house rules, and they have no idea. But in the course of doing all this, you start talking about it. I mean, this guy is a smoker. He wants to be out and sit on his lanai and have cigarettes. I mean, he understood he couldn't do it inside, but he wanted to be able to go outside on his lanai. And it wasn't going to be allowed in that. And it's clear in the documents, but he wasn't going to be able to read through it and figure that one out. So, I mean, that's a small point, but it was a big point for him. And that's true also of all the 508D disclosures that sellers are required to make, and that then buyer is supposed to go through and understand and see, and what do they mean? Again, it goes to disclose, how do we put that in a way that the client can understand, and discuss what it practically means for them. So all this comes down in my mind to timing for review and acceptance of all of this, and planning that out ahead of time, because it's going to take more time and more effort to ensure that your international client is comfortable with the property, and that his or her questions are being answered. Financial considerations, these come up because we got to get money. If I represent a buyer and the buyer's in Japan, we're going to have to wire, send funds. That takes time. Everybody in your mind, you say, okay, well, the minute it happens like that, and it just doesn't. Many times somebody wires on one end and it is not received and recognized in the account on the other side until the next next business day. That can be a real problem if you've lined up closings, for example, on a Friday, or on the day before a holiday. Again, we have the issue of we're a different date. So setting it up on a Friday when that's a Saturday in Japan is, or setting up when money is supposed to be sent over, the deadline for that, that's not ideal. I mean, all of these can be worked around by moving things, by planning in advance, but we need to be looking at that. If you're buying a property that's going to be an ongoing expense, let's say it's an income producing property because they're buying a residential that's going to be rented out, but you're going to have a management company. Okay, how are we going to pay those? I mean, we're going to wire each time. I mean, there's administrative cost to that, but how is the money going to happen? Because also the issue when you're wiring or sending funds is you're going from Japanese yen in Japan, if it's a Japanese client, to US dollars, and you are subject to whatever the luck of the draw is on your conversion rate. That and it could be significantly different between the time that you contract and the time that you close, and on an ongoing basis it could also be different. So how do you set that up? Because you are going to have property, real property taxes and other things that need to be paid in connection with your property, even if it's not income producing, even if you don't have a management company. So how are those going to happen? I have a client right now that they're paying me essentially to pay their real property taxes. They send it, it comes into our trust account, we make payments and such, but then we end up billing them for that because they don't have another management company. Setting up a U.S. bank account can be really challenging for a foreign national who doesn't have a regular presence here. They don't have a visa and they're locating here. That can be trying to set it up from abroad is almost impossible. And even when they're here, we've ran into problems with the fact that they're not living here and they're buying a property. But so that could be a challenge. Not impossible, but it is challenging. So that's one of those things that you want to be discussing with clients ahead of time is, how are we going to coordinate this and what's the best way for you? Income producing properties are going to have, now we're going to have tax obligations, both, federal and with the U.S. taxes and with Hawaii state, and that includes general excise tax and such. So filings and such will need to be made. They need to be planning ahead for that, and who's going to handle that. And finally, loans. These are usually not issues with our foreign clients because most of them wouldn't be able to get a loan here and are coming in and it's a cash buyer, which is nice. But then we deal with the wiring and a lot of other issues. But we don't end up usually having to deal too much with mortgage loans, other things. The one things we have had is cases involving foreign clients and a purchase of property where there's seller financing involved, and we have to deal with that. So number 9 was changes, problems, disputes. These are issues that come up along the way as you're going, whether it's issues, concerns about the property involved, or the timing of doing certain things, or other problems come up. The seller can't leave in time, or they're unable to get their inspections done or whatever. These kind of things happen, and usually if everybody is here in Hawaii and we don't have the same issues in terms of expectations, a lot of times these are things that get worked out between the brokers and the parties and such, and can be easy. But oftentimes there are misunderstandings, there's missed expectations and stuff that create problems and make it more difficult to do this. And so again, I think planning in advance and looking in advance down the line and realizing there needs to be a problem so it doesn't become an emergency is really helpful. Because coming in and saying, oh my gosh, tomorrow's the deadline for this and there's no way that we can do it, creates a crisis where it's not the same thing if we realize a week from now is this, but it's not going to be possible to do that. We need to work with the other party to resolve. And again, I don't know that this is that unique to international clients. It's just that it tends to come up more. Solving and resolving problems can be challenging at times. I just ended up resolving a case between 2 Japanese clients of all things, with respect to a high-end home in Kahala over here that they were in a contract to sell it. The problem was that they'd set up to have an additional deposit paid And the date of that payment, the day before it was a national holiday, and the day before that was when the client tried to move things and was unable to do it. So it came down to, okay, the day of it, they weren't able to get the money there. The seller was pointing at the time is of the essence and basically saying we're canceling everything. And so it became this giant crisis, and lawyers writing letters and threatening lawsuits, and we resolved it, but it wasn't ideal. It wasn't ideal for everybody. I mean, both parties had a really sour taste in their mouth about the other and felt that they were being somehow disrespected, and by the way it came up and it was handled. These are things that, once I was able to get involved, we were able to soften that, but some of the damage had already been done. And I realized that sometimes some effort by the representatives of both parties early on, to rather than trying to take hardline positions, to instead look at, well, we see an issue here, how can we start to soften both our position and our client and work with them to get it resolved? Because the end result was, one client wanted to buy, the other client wanted to sell. They'd all agreed on all the terms. There was really no reason that couldn't have been resolved very easily. And we were talking about a couple of days, and what turned into instead a number of months and a whole bunch of attorney's fees and people writing back and forth and threatening things. When I got involved, that was the first thing I said: stop threatening, stop it. Okay, I mean, you can do that afterwards, but let's see if we can't come out with something that at least everybody can walk away from and be okay, not happy, but okay. So dispute resolution, negotiation, usually negotiation is meaningless because we've already been negotiating all this time trying to work it out. So it's not working out. So it's a question of, are we going to have mediation or arbitration or litigation, or how are we going to handle this? They used to say that arbitration was the way to go. You should, it's way better than litigation. And they had all these reasons. And now I'm not really sure that's the case. To be honest with you, I think that we spend a lot of time now creating an arbitration system that costs a fair amount of money for clients, takes a fair amount of time, and doesn't necessarily provide any of the other benefits that we had hoped it would. It ends up discovery, everything else is now in arbitration is pretty much what it is in litigation. And you can end up with a result that doesn't jive with the law, and there's no way to appeal it. So my inclination now is not to push the arbitration as much. American Arbitration Association isn't even really here in Hawaii anymore. And so DPR is probably, the dispute prevention resolution is probably the next best option in terms of availability of people, but they're busy. It takes time. Finally, I want to talk just briefly about commercial properties. I'm running out of time here, so let me just mention that commercial properties just bring up all kinds of other issues, particularly for international clients, but for anyone. Oftentimes they have licenses and permits. I have one coming in now that they want to buy up this restaurant bar. I mean, there's a liquor license. There are other permits for the restaurant and other things. All those would have to be transferred and are major issues for an international purchaser. If you're buying into a property that has existing tenants or licensees or contracts, those will need to be assigned over. And so those are part of dealing with that kind of property. If the property is leasehold, so they're buying into a business that has a lease for space in a building, or leases the building and the property, then that lease needs to be assigned and that consent needs to be received from the landowner. And that can be a major issue, particularly when the landowner already has a strong relationship with somebody that's in the country and may not be comfortable with an international owner. There's also, for buyers then coming in and buying up businesses and commercial properties, we'd start talking about what kind of entity we want to use, how that will be structured for, tax and ownership management purposes, visa issues that come up. And again, I'm not an immigration attorney, but oftentimes we have to get an immigration attorney involved. Employment issues, we do end up helping to handle those. But if you've got staff and everything, you're buying up a restaurant or some other business that has staff, we have to deal with all the employment contracts and relationships. And then there are all kinds of other specific issues and problems that may relate to that property or to the kind of business that we're involved in. So we end up looking into those. So I mention these because the worst case scenario is that you get one of these and they're buying up a commercial property that has an ongoing business and such in it, and they've given a 30-day due diligence and 15 days after that to close, and you think there's just no way. There's just no way that all of that can be done within that time period. And particularly with an international buyer or seller, there's a lot of issues that come up. So, that's a smattering. I'm sure you have a bunch of others, and you may have some questions about either those or other issues you've dealt with. I'm just going to open myself up and be happy to talk to you about any and all of that.
Greg, fantastic. Thank you very much. It was enlightening. I made a bunch of notes. I feel like you've followed me around the last 30 years to make your top 10 list. By the way, I want to say you have the cleanest office in Hawaii, so I want to congratulate you on that, your background. Okay, we do have some good questions. First one is how to handle funds for clients. You talked about this quickly. If local bank account is not possible, how do people handle that?
Well, so there's a number of things. If it's just the acquisition of the property, a lot of times those funds can come into escrow and be held there, subject to your escrow agreement. Portions of those funds, either at closing or even before, can be distributed to pay expenses. If you, as a real estate, broker, agent, are going to hold any funds, you're going to be holding it in trust. So you want to be very careful about that. I generally don't recommend it. We have, the other things, they may have an attorney and such. We have a trust account. There are times where we've had clients that will put money in there to help pay for things like, a management company and helping to arrange that until they're able to get over and get a bank account, other things set up. So we have utilized, ourselves for that purpose. We're not a bank and we can't service as that, but if they put a certain amount in, if they put money into our trust account, to pay our fees, but also to cover other expenses that come up, we can help coordinate that. So Those are some of the ways we've worked around that problem.
Okay, great. And Craig, you can stop sharing your screen if you would.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to point something out. Your first number one point of contention is misunderstanding. And a quick commercial for the International Real Estate Council. We've done Real Estate Abroad Part 1 and Part 2, where we've spoken to agents in Korea, China, Japan, Canada to understand how business is done there, right? And you're shaking your head yes, because it's very different in these areas, isn't it?
That's my understanding and I'd say experience. I've never sold property in another country yet. But I've met a lot of attorneys, real estate attorneys, and brokers in Japan, and then I've rented properties and such there, but I've never been involved with the purchase there. So
I've worked in 8 different countries and many states, and it's different everywhere, but it's important for agents to know. Okay, next question. Proof of funds. The best way for someone who's representing someone from Japan to demonstrate this proof of funds? Obviously, it's going to come in a Japanese account, a yen account. Any advice there?
For Japan, they've typically, most people have accepted essentially the snapshot of the bank account that holds the funds that has been certified by the bank, and they're able to do that. And so that's usually what we've received and passed on. But of course, it's in yen, so then you're kind of doing a conversion. When we've had those, the funds in the bank were well in excess of the amounts that they were going to need to pay, so the concern wasn't there. But I think that what you've raised is a good issue, which is that if there's a proof of funds requirement, if that's going to be required in the in the purchase contract, then there's no reason that you can't, either in an addendum or in even in section Q, in your special terms, to just indicate what you're going to provide, what will be provided for that, so that it's clear that they don't come back and say, well, that's not acceptable to us. I mean, tell them what you're going to give them.
Yep. Okay, good. Question, and you touched on this as well. I'm going to combine these two questions. How do you handle requests from your clients who say, hey, translate all those condo docs for me? Or for agents who receive the requests from their clients, we have Japanese agents, the client says, hey, please translate this document for me, or this purchase contract. How do you handle it, and what's your advice to agents that receive those requests?
Yeah, so the situation is a little different for agents that get the request than me, in that I can very quickly tell them, look, at my hourly rate, the last thing in the world you want me doing is translating things for you. You truly don't. So we can get a professional translator, and I have a number of people that I can refer them to that will formally translate it, and that translation will be exactly correct. The interesting thing is, and this has only happened within the last few years, that now we're sort of at a point where your Google Translate and other translators will do a pretty decent job. And so it depends on how important it is that the exact language of that is translated, and can I get it in a form or in a way that will that it'll read it and be able to translate it for them. Okay, so for example, I work with Japanese clients a lot. They will write to me in Japanese, and I tell them that's not a problem. But if you want me to write back to you in Japanese, that's going to take a lot longer, and you're paying for my time. And my Japanese is not going to be perfect when I'm writing it back to you, and it's going to take more time. We're better off be writing you in English, and just you can translate. I mean, you can run it through your translator. If you have any questions about it, call me, and we'll talk about it in Japanese or in English. So
what's your advice to agents when they receive those requests from their clients?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I would not get into that position for two reasons. Okay. One, for the most part, and I appreciate there may be some of you that this is an exception. You're not a professional translator. You don't want to play one on TV, and you don't want to play one with your client. It'll be a never-ending battle of you writing and translating stuff all the time. Okay. So I think you need to figure out, I would invest somehow, or have the firm invest, if you've got enough Japanese clients, in having the standard real estate, Hawaii Association of Real Estate purchase contract translated. But I think it already has been. I think it's available. I've seen it. So you can provide.
Yeah. That's what we did for our company. We provided both a Chinese and a Japanese translated version, done by a professional translator. Of course, disclaimer everywhere. Okay, next question, got a bunch of them. What is your suggestion regarding vesting, holding title? It's a big question, but I suspect this would relate to taxation, estate planning, liability. Do you have any suggestions in a typical vanilla deal, person buying from overseas?
Well, I mean, it depends so much on what they're buying it for. And what they're going to be doing. So, if they're buying it because they just want a property here, they come and visit at times, and they're not renting it out. It's not an income producing property, or it's not intended to be. It's just for them. Then we have a succession planning type issue. So is it just one of them? So often with the Japanese, I have them come over and we're just putting the husband's name on it. And okay, what happens when you pass away or you can't do anything? And this is where we get into, do we try and arrange and have it set up in some kind of trust? And that can be done. You may not get quite the same tax benefits that you have if you're a U.S. resident, but it may be valuable from the standpoint of legally being able to transmit legally being able to act on behalf of the property, and then who it goes to, and then be able to step in and do things here, because without it, it's a real problem. So the two things I'd say is that's one, and two is everybody has this idea, well, we'll just create a single member LLC. And I've had, I don't know how many times where I guess some attorney had advised them just make it a single member LLC, and not thinking about the fact that, even for that didn't solve the one problem that they were asked to resolve, which is that when I sell it, I don't want to have a withholding because it's a disregarded entity. And so unless you've elected to have it taxed as a corporation that's separate and you pay taxes that way, you're going to be stuck with the same withholding.
And can you say that one more time? Because I think this is something so misunderstood by real estate agents. You say it one more time. So forming a single entity LLC for your foreign owner does not exempt you from the withholding. Is that correct? That's right.
It does not exempt you from withholding, either FIRPTA or HARPTA. And that's simply because it's a disregarded entity for tax purposes. So they're going to look through to the owners. And if one or more of the owners is an international person, then that percentage, it's 100%, is going to be subject to FIRPTA and HARPTA.
Thank you. And kind of related, there's a question that came in. As agent is saying they've heard of clients using local addresses, maybe even their agent's address, as their billing address. Does that exempt them in any way from the withholding?
But that would be no, it does not.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, using that address just means that that's where the tax bill is going to be sent to.
Yes. Okay. There is another question about the notaries, and thank you for touching on that. That was one of the questions came in early. But there was an agent that on our call today said the notary was found invalid. They had done it outside the U.S. Embassy, and they were told it has to be on U.S. soil. Does that jibe with what you know, or you're saying there are some notary providers that outside the embassy in Japan that can notarize documents?
It cannot be a U.S. notary outside off U.S. soil. So
I see.
So it would have to be a Japanese notary, and then you'd have to include that apostille, and then it has to be translated. You have to go through the rules to do those.
Okay. Okay. Great. And you've mentioned this in your talk earlier, but what would you say is the number one, number two most surprising thing that we use clients from Japan learn when they come to buy or sell in Hawaii? I know you had 10 on there, but is there anything that really sticks out to you?
Oh, in terms of the things that surprise them, I think, I think they're surprised, for example, because a lot of them are buying into condo properties in Waikiki and other things, because that's, Hawaii is Waikiki, and a lot of times and they're just overwhelmed by the amount of rules and paperwork. I mean, the amount of stuff that comes at them, and of course it's in another language too, which makes it even harder. But even as an English speaker, if I got all that and I wasn't an attorney, I mean, man, it seems almost impossible to figure out what's going on and what's important. And so if you put yourself in their shoes for a little bit, I think that's probably one of the biggest ones. And then also, I think, the idea, and I've heard this from a number, is that, wow, everybody is so strict about everything with timing and with all. I mean, we're entering into this deal. They're going to get all their money. Why is this such a huge problem that we ran into a problem converting the funds, and it's going to take an extra day? And you can explain it, but in Japan, everybody, apparently everybody essentially understands that, it's okay and it'll work out. And it isn't as strict on that, is what I'm hearing. That's certainly the way it's been responded to me numerous times.
Yes. And then what about verbal negotiation? Have you found that to be common with some of the foreign clientele that you've worked with?
Yes. In fact, often they want to speak to the other side if there's some issue or problem, and oftentimes they're prevented, and they're very frustrated that, hey, look, if I can just talk. In the one case I was telling you about, we never were able to have just the two parties talk to each other, and I was suggesting, well, why don't we just let them talk? Okay, I mean, they're both Japanese, and they both got English-speaking attorneys, arguing back and forth and fighting and threatening things. And then I come in and I'm English-speaking, and why don't we just let them talk to each other and explain? I mean, they actually might be okay with it. All this. I try to put it going the other way. I think those kind of verbal negotiations can work, but attorneys are very uncomfortable with it. And I can be too. I mean, I'm real worried about what's going to get said. And if the attorneys aren't there, who knows what the client might be saying or committing to or agreeing happened or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a real reluctance.
Yeah, and then we find that when the clients come to town from different parts of the world where verbal negotiation is common, you do all of that before you now start to put pen to paper. Whereas in Hawaii, we absolutely don't go down that path, and it's caused some pretty big conflicts. So, yeah. Well, Craig, we have come to the end of our time. Cannot thank you enough. It's been so enlightening, everything that you talked about today. For everyone that's joined us, Craig's information is in the chat. It'll also be available when this recording is released. As I mentioned, I work with him. He's fantastic. 5-star recommendation. And he'll show you his clean office if you see him soon. So yeah. Thanks, Craig. So to everyone, thank you very much. So until next time, be well, be kind, and aloha. We'll see you at the next event.